I was asked to discuss or talk about diseases in pulse crops, specifically irrigated pulse crops, but I'm also going to touch a little bit on our dryland crops as well that are common in this area. Okay, so part of SPG's mandate, we have a number of different pulse crops under our purview that we are actively working on increasing adoption, increasing suitability, and increasing those pulse acres within the province. And these include our main acre crops, so lentil, pea, and chickpea, faba bean, soybean, and dry bean, and then we just recently adopted fenugreek. And so fenugreek is a minor acre, a new pulse crop that we currently added. And myself and Michael split these crops as we split geographies as well. So Michael's area covers off lentil, chickpea, dry bean, and I cover off pea, faba bean, soybean. We overlap a little bit on dry bean, and then he, lucky guy, also gets a little bit of the fenugreek because it's grown in the south as well. The other thing that we're doing as agronomy managers with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers is we have a number of agronomic priorities that we're focusing on: research and innovation, and actively trying to increase this adoption of pulse acres across the province. And so we have some 5 key areas. A couple of them are long-term and 3 of them are short-term. So our long-term areas, see if I can get this to work. Oh my God, slow down. Our long-term areas are genetic gain, so the right genetics for the right place, and root rot. Those are our 2 long-term areas. And then our short-term investment areas would be integrated pest management, fertility and plant health, and then agronomic practice. So this is where your levy dollars as growers is being spent and focused on to try to innovate and push forward the adoption and suitability of pulse crops in the province. But really what I'm here to talk about today is disease. So I'm going to start off with just some highlights from the 2022 Pulse Disease Survey. This is a little bit hard to see, but there are 2 aspects to the disease survey that I'm going to present today. The first is incidence and the second is prevalence. And so incidence is the number of total plants that had tested positive for symptoms. So if you went out to a field and you collected 100 plants and 76 of those plants tested positive for the disease, you would have an incidence of 76%. Taking a further step back, a little bit of a bigger picture, when we look at prevalence, that would be how many fields had positively tested plants for that disease. So prevalence is fields, incidence is plants within a field. Make sense? And yeah, these are a little bit hard to see, but when we look then at the prevalence of disease in lentil crops in the province in 2022, so how many fields tested positive by disease, we're looking here in the red box is root rot complex. And the numbers are difficult to see, so I'll explain them. On the left-hand side is our growing areas within the province, so southwest, southeast, east central, west central, northwest, and the whole province overall. We have the number of fields surveyed, so these are the number of fields that are contributing to this percentage number. Then root rot complex, so our seedling root rots. The next column is anthracnose, and the last one is Stemphylium blight. But when we look at the numbers, the percentage of prevalence, root rot complex dominates in our lentil disease survey. So anthracnose actually is the second one. And so when we look at the foliar diseases and the impact that that's having in our lentil crops, we're seeing that there's also high numbers of infected lentil fields showing anthracnose disease pressure. And so in West Central, well, if I can do this, West Central, 100% of the fields tested positive for anthracnose, and 85% tested positive for root rot complex. There was a little bit of Stemphylium blight overall in the province, 49%. Sorry. West Central was 46% of fields tested positive for Stemphylium. And so looking at these numbers, we can say that root rot complex and anthracnose pose the greatest challenges to lentil production in 2022 for our pulse growers. Shifting gears to prevalence of disease in pea crops, so again, the number of fields that tested positive. Root rot complex, 100% across the board. Every field, every growing region, 100% of our fields had root rot complex. We are seeing some impacts of, I'm so sorry. The next column is Microspirella or Ascochyta complex, then the next one to the right is white mold, and the last one is bacterial blight. We are seeing a smattering of different disease pressures in each of those foliar diseases, but by and far, root rot complex is the #1 pulse disease in our pea production in 2022. When we shift gears to look at the severity of that disease, so we know every field in the province had Aphanomyces or root rot complex. When we shift gears to how bad was that infection, we're looking here at the severity of that disease. So, root rot complex average incidence, so again, this is how many plants within each field tested positive. And then the severity rating is on the side. So we have a range of 2.4 to 4, or 1.8, sorry, 1.7 to 4.9. And this is on a rating scale of 1 to 7. 1 being completely fine, no infection, 7 being completely dead. And we can see that in West Central, 66% incidence, so 66 plants out of 100 in a field tested positive. And the severity of that disease was about 2.6, so not super high on a 1 to 7 scale, but still present. It's not a 1. We still are seeing some detrimental effects. Next, when we look at soybean disease incidence, we're looking at bacterial blight and brown spot. And so 100% of fields tested positive for both of these diseases. And in soybeans for bacterial blight, 94% incidence. So out of the plants that were sampled, 94% of them tested positive for bacterial blight. And an average severity of 2.8. So this is actually on a scale of 0 to 5. And we're seeing, over that 50% or over that midway point for severity. So we're starting to encroach on some pretty heavy infestations or killing diseases, killing infections of bacterial blight. Brown spot was a little bit less, 81%, and severity of 1.5. So not as much of a concern. Bacterial blight would definitely be the leading disease that we're focused on here. When we look to 2023, the map that we're looking at, this is one of Les Henry's wonderful maps that he produces every year. So this is soil moisture as of November 1st, 2022. So we're looking pretty dry still. It's a little bit better than it was last year. I'm not going to show you last year's graph or map, but it is better. I promise you it's better. What I do want to point out, though, is this chart on the left-hand side, and it might be hard to see, but this is projected weather for 2023 according to the Farmer's Almanac. And so the blue bars are precipitation, and any blue bar above the center line is above average, and the red bars are temperature. So anything above is above average, anything below is below average. And I've circled in yellow here May through October, and we can see that May is going to be wetter and warmer than normal. June will be a little bit dry but drier. July is almost even, and then August and September are projected to have higher moisture levels. Now, whether this holds true or not, meteorologists can be wrong 99% of the time and still be employed, so don't hold me to this, but this is the long-term projected forecast for 2023. And what this means for diseases in our pulse crops and overall, is yet to be seen, but this gives us a little bit of an outlook. And so, when we talk about diseases and pulses, the first thing I want to go over again is our root rots. And so when we look at root rot, the first thing is that root rot complex in our main large acre crops. So root rot complex is largely dominated by Aphanomyces, but often occurs in conjunction with Fusarium, Pythium, and Rhizoctonia species. Aphanomyces was first identified in 2012. And what we can see, it's very difficult to see in these pictures, I apologize, but on the left, the middle two pictures, we've got those nice honey brown roots, and I shouldn't say nice, but honey brown roots that we see that are very typical of an Aphanomyces infection. And then on the far right is that blackening, really dark color that we associate with the Fusarium infection. And so with Aphanomyces, we need to have three things like any disease. We need to have this disease triangle satisfied to have an infection. And so the pathogen is a long-lived oospore that's present in the soil. We need to have a susceptible host, so pure lentil or equally susceptible. And then we need high moisture content. And when we talk about moisture in irrigated fields, this becomes a pretty common thing. Moisture isn't something that you guys are starving for. We have relatively moist soils. You're trying to keep them at least at a good crop level. And so we end up getting, when all of these things are satisfied, we have the right conditions to have an Aphanomyces or root rot complex infection. So what are we seeing here? This is a lentil field, or 2 lentil fields side by side, was farmed separately and then put together as a half section. Does anyone know the difference? You can answer, Mike. The left side had 1 more rotation of lentils. And it just so happened that they built a spore load in a year where there was a perfect combination of host, weather, and pathogen present. And then the next time they grew a lentil field, that disease triangle was satisfied, and we had a detrimental Phanomyces or root rot complex infection set in. The other side of the field didn't suffer. So this is what we're facing in our larger acre pulse crops, and it's a really big issue, and we're actively working on it, but it's very challenging. And so what do we know so far? I've hit a few of these already, so I'll go through them quickly. But a Phanomyces is a noomycete, can live in the soil for 10 plus years. I've heard 20 years from different researchers. We actually don't know the half-life of this zoospore yet. It needs moisture for infection, so when you have irrigated production, if this is something that you have a host crop present, obviously not pure lentil, but if you do have a host crop present, this could become an issue. Spore loads will build up over time, and so drought will not reduce the spore load present in your soil. They will just go into dormancy, and when that moisture is present again, they will go into their reproductive cycle and they will activate. Most problematic infections of Phanomyces occurs when it's in that complex, so again, in conjunction with their other root rot diseases. You can use a seed treatment to get some type of control, but I will caution you, this will only provide some level of control when you are in a low risk situation. So when you are not dealing with a high frequency of rotation of peas or lentils, you do not have a high spore load identified, you have not had a detrimental infection in the previous years. So only in a low risk situation will a seed treatment really give you the silver bullet magic that you're looking for. The biggest thing that we're seeing so far is that you keep your crops healthy. So just like you and I, when we get stressed, tired, we're dehydrated, we're not eating well, we get sick easier. European lentil crops are going to be the same way. If we keep them healthy, keep them stress-free, give them a good fertility package, they're going to have a better ability to withstand or tolerate a root rot infection. But there are no real fixes, and right now rotation is the only real thing that we have to combat this. And so most of our pea and lentil guys are looking at 6 to 8 year rotations on Phanomyces management practices. And again, this picture's hard to see, but this is a pea field showing the exact same thing. So a half section put together. The left side had 1 more rotation of peas, and it yielded about 7, I believe. And then the right side yielded closer to 65. As far as management tools that are available to growers and agronomists, this form is available on our website. But I would highly recommend looking at utilizing soil tests, particularly the bait test methods. So you can make a request at your lab that you're working with. If you take a soil sample, ask them to perform the bait test method. That's where they plant, take the bulk soil, they saturate it up to field capacity, they plant a host seedling in there, and then they do an extraction after 7 days. And they do a DNA analysis to see if you have a Phanomyces present or not, particularly with dry soils. We're seeing a lot of false negatives, and the bait test method isn't 100% all the time, but it's definitely giving more accurately positive results. If you're considering growing pea and lentil this year and you grew them in 2016 per se, when we had some decent moisture conditions, I would look seriously at the length of rotation, what the condition of that crop was the last time you grew it on that field. Did you have an infection? Was it detrimental? Was it okay? That type of thing. So the symptomology the last time you grew a crop, the frequency, and then also soil texture and drainage will have an impact as well. So heavier soils, more compacted, are going to cause some more severe infections. Moving on from our large acre crops into some of our smaller acre crops, and more specific to this area, dry bean. So this was actually something that was new to me since coming on with the Pulse Growers. I've learned a lot about dry bean, but dry bean is also susceptible to a root rot complex as well. And this complex consists of Fusarium solani, Rhizoctonia solani, Pythium species, so all the 3 major species that we're dealing with in our other large acre crops, and then Chilera vesicola. Some classes of dry bean are also susceptible to Aphanomyces root rot. Not all of them, but some classes and varieties are susceptible. So this is something that we also have to manage and look at in our dry bean acres. Again, susceptibility is really down to general health of the crop, looking at field history. Cultivar susceptibility is a really big one. And then the environmental conditions. So more compact, poorly drained soils will tend to have higher infections with root rot. Also, herbicide carryover can have an impact as well, so that crop is stressed. It's dealing with trying to process this herbicide that it's not tolerant to, and then it's weakened and it can be more susceptible to having a root rot infection. So some of the management strategies: use clean seed, use a seed treatment, good fertility, good rotation management, and also a non-susceptible or a tolerant variety. So the variety that we grow most commonly, to my understanding, in the province is CBC blackstrap, and it is resistant or tolerant to Aphanomyces. So that's one benefit that we have. We're already adopting a moderately resistant variety or tolerant variety to Aphanomyces, but that doesn't mean it isn't susceptible to our other root rots in this complex. Next, when we look at the soybeans, the major disease issue that we're looking at here is Phytophthora. And so Phytophthora is unique to soybeans. It causes root and stem disease. We can see an infection at any point in the growing season, and it can actually cause late season infections. You'll see chocolate brown lesions that will extend up from the soil surface, and then you get the yellowing of the plant tissue. And if you can't really see, but in this picture you can see that one plant is just wilted and dying. This is fairly common, particularly in non-heavy soybean growing areas. You can see just one or two plants or patches of plants within a field that will just get hit with it and just die off. Again, heavy, compacted, saturated soils. Management strategies here: grow a tolerant variety. So lots of the new varieties on the market today have multiple genetic resistance built in for soybeans: nematode, iron deficiency, chlorosis, and Phytophthora. And then the other option is to rotation. So with root rot, there's a lot of management strategy that is solely based on rotation, and soybean is no different. So we're looking at rotating further out 4+ years if you have a Phytophthora infection. Okay, I'm going to move on to foliar diseases. Are there any questions on root rots before I move forward? Okay. So again, I'm going to start with our larger acre crops, and I'm just going to focus on the biggest, most pressing disease issues foliar-wise in our larger acre pulse crops. And so in peas, the biggest concern right now is actually Mycosphaerella pinoides. So this is actually the problem child of our pea pathogens. It is the sexual life cycle stage of Ascochyta pinoides. And the reason it's such a problem child is because it's very aggressive. It is the most prolific pathogen in our pea crops. It has really high spore production, and those spores are long-lived resting spores in the soil. They also overwinter and are spread by wind, stubble, soil, and water, so just about any mechanism you have for spreading spores. And the Ascochyta pinoides has a really high history of pathogen and sensitivity. So when we get into fungicide applications, because it's polycyclic and it can infect multiple times in a season, this disease can build resistance to fungicides very, very quickly, which makes it a much more challenging disease than we would think that it actually is. Which leads me to chickpeas. So when we talk about Ascochyta, you can't not talk about chickpeas. And so the pathogen in chickpeas is actually Ascochyta rabii. And lots of the same qualities for this Ascochyta infection that we're seeing in peas, but again, repeated infections. In chickpeas, spraying for Ascochyta is the #1 fungicide use in the province. So growers are spraying 2 to 3 times. I don't know if guys are spraying more than 3 times, but there are multiple applications of fungicide going down in a season to try and control this disease because it's polycyclic and will infect at any growth period or any growth point. And this is because it's highly adaptable and consists of that sexual stage. And so in peas you get those little brown lesions. I didn't really talk about them, but in chickpeas you get these nice tan concentric circles and rings, and you get pycnidia in the center. And so you'll get complete die-off on the branches and the stem, and they'll just turn brown, but on the pods and leaves it will start off as these little brown tan concentric circles, and then you'll see the pycnidia in the middle. On the theme of Ascochyta, we can't not talk about lentils if we're going to talk about Ascochyta. And so in lentils, the pathogen is actually Ascochyta lentis. And similarly, it is both seed and stubble-borne. Spores are produced by pycnidia, and they'll spread from plants and residue borne also by rain splash. So you get that rain action happening, and those spores will splash up, infecting all parts of the plant similar to our other crops. And then can also cause discoloration of the seed within the pods if the pods are infected. The good news is that we do have some, majority varieties are resistant to this pathogen, and so we're seeing a lot less infection as we move forward with the release of some new tolerant varieties in lentils. But again, we're looking at tan to gray lesions with dark margins, and then the tiny pycnidia in the middle when you're assessing this in field. Next in lentils, anthracnose. So this is really the big hitter for lentils, caused by, I'm gonna sewer this, but Colidotriticum lentis. So this pathogen overwinters as microsclerotia on the stubble and can survive up to 4 years in the soil. So rotation again becomes pretty important and pretty key. Sporulation will occur, and then lesions and disease is polycyclic again. So when we have that initial point of infection, it will progress rapidly. And if any of you have ever inspected a field for anthracnose, you know that once that disease triangle is hit, you can come in a few days later and that lower canopy can just be ripe with anthracnose from the bottom up. And so again, it'll start from the bottom and move its way up. And we're looking for sunken gray to cream colored lesions on leaves and stem that also contain tiny black microsclerotia. There are actually 2 races of anthracnose that have been identified in the province. We do have some resistance to race 1, but there are absolutely no varieties on the market to date that have resistance or partial resistance to race 0. And so trying to tell Ascochyta apart from anthracnose, this is trying to show that, but for Ascochyta, we're looking again for tan gray lesions, dark margins, and pycnidia. In anthracnose, we're looking for light beige gray lesion, water soaked or a burnt cigar looking lesion, and then microsclerotia. And so I think Gersie has hand lenses at the back. I tried to sweet talk him out of one, but a tool like that would be really useful when walking a lentil field. Before I move on to our irrigated crop diseases, I will just say that for lentils, seed-borne anthracnose, we have a rating of 5% seed-borne anthracnose is tolerated. If you have 5 to 10%, use a seed treatment. If you have higher than 10% on that seed lot, don't seed it. Ascochyta, seed-borne Ascochyta in chickpeas, the tolerance is 0.03%. So if you have a chickpea grower and he has Ascochyta-borne, seed-borne Ascochyta, do not seed it. He can seed treat, but the recommendation is, unless it's a clean seed lot, do not seed it. So just something to keep in mind if you are dealing with any chickpea or lentil growers that have some seed-borne seed lots, seed-borne disease seed lots. So next I'm going to talk about halo and common bacterial blight in dry bean. And so these are actually 2 different pathogens. They're bacterial pathogens, but the symptomology, the infection periods, the impact on yield, and the management practices are almost identical. So I put them together into one slide, but they are 2 different pathogens. So these pathogens can infect at any time during the growing season. Symptoms are typically small brown spots, and then will progress to be surrounded by a light green or yellow halo. Specifically, the halo blight bacterium produces a toxin when temperatures are less than 21 degrees at any part during the day. And so this can cause some issues throughout that growing season. Both of these pathogens are carried on seed and will spread from plant to plant by rain, hail, irrigation, or wind. And so if we have bacterial blight present in our dry beans and they're under irrigation production, irrigation will, any type of flowing water or splash will progress that disease throughout your field. And this will set in very rapidly. So once you start seeing symptoms, a few days later you can lose the whole crop, and we see that more commonly in irrigated production rather than dryland production. Control management practices, use disease-free seed and use a seed treatment. Manage your rotation 2 to 3 years. Another thing that we found is that turning under plant debris as soon as you can following harvest, but not when the field is wet. So again, Moisture is going to spread this pathogen, so as long as the field is dry, the sooner you can turn this debris under, the better it will be to control the spread of inoculum. Avoid over-irrigating. So we heard a lot already about irrigation scheduling and management strategies. This will be really important in controlling your diseases. As Gersa Hughes said, this is the one part of irrigated production. Disease management is very challenging. Another solution, and I would echo his previous comments, that use fungicide as the last effort as part of an integrated pest management strategy, but there are copper-based fungicides that can slow the infection, but they're not going to cure it. Next, the other disease of concern in dry bean is white mold, and so this is actually a Sclerotinia species. And so typical to other Sclerotinia pathogens, we're looking at, it favors cool temperatures, high humidity, and dense canopies, right? So we're used to seeing Sclerotinia in canola, not very dissimilar in dry bean. It will overwinter as sclerotia bodies and crop debris in soil. And again, we're seeing that light brown water soap discoloration on pods and cotton thready-like growth. Plants can be killed in a couple days, so it can move in again very quickly into our dry bean population. Management again is looking at burying all crop residues. And in dry bean, for management of white mold, it is recommended to avoid irrigating after rows close over, or using a wider row spacing and decreased seeding rate. So if this is a disease of issue, these are some of the strategies. Whether that's as relevant in this growing region for dry bean, I'm not the expert yet on dry beans, I'm getting there. But there have been some work being done on seeding rates and narrower row production systems with dry bean. So this could be something that we need to do some more work on, particularly in Saskatchewan for dry bean production. Another management strategy is 4+ years of rotation. So again, that rotation piece coming into play. And then we can also apply a fungicide preventatively, similar to how we do in other crops. Next for soybeans, so this will be the last of soybeans will be the last crop I'm going to discuss as far as disease pathogens, but one of the biggest issues that we face province-wide in soybeans is iron deficiency chlorosis. And so ICD, or IDC, sorry, I have that backwards on the slide, I apologize. But IDC is often associated with a lack of iron in the plant, and it can actually be induced or occur in higher proportions when you have high soluble salt and carbonate percentage in your soil. And so this was taken from Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, but what this graph is, or chart is essentially showing is that with every 0.1 unit increase of IDC infection, equates to a 2.4 to 2.8 yield loss in soybean production. And as we look at this table, as you move down the left-hand side in soluble salt or salinity, so this is the equivalent, the units is the equivalent of decisiemens per centimeter for those of you who know salinity ratings. And then across the top is carbonate level as a percentage. So as you become more saline and your carbonate level increases, the risk of developing an iron deficiency chlorosis infection significantly increases. And as we increase on that IDC scale, every 0.1 on a 0 to 5 scale equates to almost 3 bushels an acre loss in yield. In irrigated production, I'm not fully up to speed on the salinity issues or what the salinity is here in this area or what we're facing as far as irrigated water. I do know that in other parts of Western Canada, we are facing some pretty serious salinity issues in irrigated production, particularly in southern Manitoba. So this is definitely a concern, but if you are getting your water tested, look for carbonate levels if you are a soybean grower. Make sure that your soluble salts are low, that your carbonate levels are low, and you can help avoid this pathogen setting in. The other issue with the risk to developing an IDC infection is that iron is not mobile in the plant, so you can apply an iron chelate to the soil, but if you apply it on the plant, it's not going to be mobile either, so it will sit where it is in the plant and it will not translocate throughout the plant tissues. Other prevention, there are lots of varieties on the market now that have tolerance bred into them genetically. Avoid poorly drained soils, apply some heavier seeding rates, which will help. Reduce soil nitrogen levels, and just one thing to note, foliar sprays will be ineffective on this because of that lack of iron mobility within the plant. And last but not least, anthracnose in soybean. So similar to our anthracnose infection in our other crops, it's not very dissimilar in soybeans. So again, this pathogen will overwinter as setae on the stubble, so not pycnidia, not sclerotia, but setae. And those are black little spines that you can see. I don't know if you can see, but you can see the black on this far right picture, but they're called setae. And they're little black spines that the anthracnose pathogen will form on stubble at the end of the season. Sporulation again will occur and infect the lower parts of the plants and move upward. As Gersa mentioned, as far as fungal pathogens, it loves warm, moist conditions. And anthracnose, typical, it can infect at any time during the growing season. In soybeans, however, though, if you have an early season infection, the symptoms may not show up until later in the season, which is kind of unique. You can control this disease again by spraying a fungicide at the onset of flowering as a preventative measure. And so as far as management practices overall, when we look at pulse diseases, particularly for foliar diseases, boots on the ground are going to be our best defense against disease. So scout for environment, canopy conditions, and the presence of symptoms. We're really looking to analyze satisfying the symptoms of that disease triangle. Do we have all three corners of that triangle present? Do we have disease present? Next, we can apply a fungicide prior to row closure and ensure that we have adequate canopy coverage. So we want to do this preventatively. You don't want to be reactionary when it comes to fungicide applications or disease management. This needs to be a proactive preventative approach. Ideally in pulse crops particularly, you want to do this before you see the first lower stem lesions. Once we're seeing that lower stem lesion already in place, the disease is already moving its way up the crop, and we typically it will move very fast, transferring from plant to plant, and that subcanopy humidity is going to be very high. When favorable conditions, you might need to do another application. So in our chickpeas, our lentils, we're seeing multiple rounds of fungicide being applied due to those pathogens and that polycyclic behavior. One thing I would try to drive home is don't miss your optimal fungicide window waiting for flowers. So again, going back to when you start to see the conditions are present for a disease, or you start to see those infection levels showing up, those lesions on the lower half of the stem, even if you haven't hit flowering, it still might be time to apply a fungicide. And you probably have heard this over and over and over again, water is going to be your friend when looking at foliar applications. We want to penetrate that canopy, especially if you are approaching row closure in some of our more heavier canopy crops. Water coverage, canopy penetration is going to be essential. And then general best management practices, we're looking at avoiding tight pulse rotations, environmental and rotational record keeping. So keep track of what you're applying, when you're applying it, the conditions you applied it in. This could have an impact on efficacy if you have to go back and check or have a conversation with your retailer or your manufacturer. Look at preventative applications, thorough coverage, selecting the effective fungicides, so not just doing the same group over and over every year. Following that label, avoid standalone groups, particularly group 11, and I'm going to touch on this briefly. And then again, mix multiple modes of action when possible. And this is the reason I bring this up is because this is what we're seeing currently in our larger acre crops. So I talked a lot about Ascochyta. All three of these images are showing an Ascochyta infection in chickpea, lentil, and pea, and all of them have developed strobilurin resistance. So group 11 fungicide resistance has been confirmed across the board in all of these crops in the same pathogen. Different species of the same pathogen, but still within Ascochyta. And that's due to that polycyclic behavior. So it's highly mutatable, can infect at any time in the growing season, and strobilurins as a group are only one target site of control, so it's easy to develop a resistance against it, particularly for a disease of this type. So where possible, avoid using a standalone group 11 or a group 11 at all if you are targeting Ascochyta. And so again, I'm going to drive these home as many times as possible, but particularly when we look at fungicide insensitivity in our pulse crops across the board, avoiding tight pulse rotations, sticking to that pulse rotation is a key, whether it's root rots you're managing or foliar diseases. Preventative applications, coverage, label, avoid single active use, and look at multiple mode of action products to avoid building up genetic resistance or resistance to other fungicide groups that we are currently relying heavily on at the moment. Thank you. Any questions?